Hello and welcome to Strangers in a Straight Land, a podcast of queer spoken word. This week is going to be a little different than the other episodes. Instead of reading a couple poems, today I have just one for you. And it's not strictly a poem per se, it's a spoken word piece which is slightly different. For those of you who don't know the difference, poetry tends to be meant to be read, which can be allowed, but often not with a lot of intonation or expression in the poem. In fact, there's a lot of traditionalist poets who read poems very monotonally or strictly without emotion, following the meter and allowing the words themselves to express the ideas or emotions or whatever it is that the poem is trying to express. While spoken word is a type of poetry as well, but specifically meant to be performed or heard. Therefore, there's a lot of stylistic changes that happen with word choice and length. They tend to be longer, less emphasis placed upon rhyme or meter, or even rhyming sometimes. It's more free form. It can be still very strictly metered or rhymed, but it just depends. The point is to perform it. So it's much more like theater than a written or purely literary piece. The point is often to evoke emotion, to force the listener to feel particular things, to experience particular things along with the poet as they perform the piece itself. And therefore it's going to be a lot more expressive, dramatic, and the intonation, the performance of it as well is also a stylistic device to do these things, not just the words themselves. And so if we're going to break it down, I guess, to the heart of it, what's the difference between spoken word and traditional poetry, is that in traditional poetry, it's the written word that has the power, that's intended to have the power, the words themselves. And so when it's read aloud, people will often not perform it in any particular way or make sure their voices are devoid of emotion or any particular emphasis and allow the words themselves, the rhyme and the meter, to express the ideas, while spoken word is very much the opposite. If it does contain rhyme or meter, the point will be to allow the performer or the poet to use those things to create interesting sound or feeling to emphasize the words and the emotion they're putting into the performance. As some of you may realize or know already, the poems I've been doing up until now, I have not been speaking without intonation or expression. So breaking a bit of, well, at least some traditionalist ideas of poetry reading, because I can't help it. I grew up in theater and I perform things and that's what I like. So in a sense, all the poetry reading I do is spoken word in some way as well, because that's just who I am. But this piece in particular was meant to be performed as more traditional spoken word. And it's called I Remember. I remember the day I kissed loving goodbye, as I stared into the pitfalls of my childhood's eye and willed every pubescent dream of happiness I had to fade like a flower that dies before it has a chance to smile at the bright blue sky. I remember. I remember what it was like growing up in a life where I was the butt of every other boy's jibe, in my side knives driven deep by insecurities they hide, internalized. They compromised by shouting their fists into my eyes. Beat unto death their reflection in the iris of my cries, destroy the image that revealed their lies. These eyes that proved kindness and creativity were more manly than beating up a faggot until the spark of hope for happiness in his smile has died. And I remember what it was like to lose my trust of men, to be abused by the hand of one called friend, to love someone so dearly I could not see him bend my will to his whim, words and hands twisting reality to a dark and blurred projection of his sin, like a demon in my mind, worming its way in, like a cancer spreading fast within perceptions of who I am. I remember getting left behind, sobbing in an empty parking lot, blind with tears my eyes, the deafening silence of my peers saying it was I who lied, bringing to light our religious leader's abusive side. And though he was asked to apologize that I felt like he had hurt me, it was me who was ostracized, forced to leave my friends behind, attend church every week, and stare into my abuser's eyes. And I remember I remember what it was like to see my parents gaze in shock and worry when they found out a boy of 13 doesn't know the internet has a history, that it will not keep your secrets, that pornography loves pubescent lives. But what caused them to cringe and shock and alarm wasn't the lurid caption of the human form, but that the subject of this little boy's gaze, a forlorn longing, focused on the phallic horn that trumpeted his desire for an alternative kind of porn. Cue our somber film to cut away to years spent in reparative therapy. Play a heart-wrenching tune, plenty of slow-motion zooms, a sad vignette of shock and gloom as a boy of 13 watches the walls of his life close until he has no room to cry anymore. His existence already a sarcophagus of self-hatred, masquerading as righteousness. And when he has taken in the last fresh breath of happiness left to him, let the picture fade to black. And remember, I remember what it was like to wish my death, to draw every last agonizing breath, praying for the end. I remember what it was like to bear the pain, to wear the weight of the 1,000 names for worthless the demons whispered in my brain. I remember how to live a self-embodied lie, to wake every day pretending to live by a mountain of unattainable expectations piled upon the weakness of my shoulders, like boulders on an ant, like the world held up by the trembling arms of Atlas. Every second his knees shiver and beg to break beneath the weight of hate-filled images forced upon his infant eyes. I remember what it was like to study in a private Christian school where morality was the dress code but hypocrisy was cool, where gossip and lying and pride were the rule, but a boy who liked theater deserved the cruelty of his peers. Ridicule piled upon the one who could not conform to a cultural preconception of a masculine norm that left no room for deviance. I remember growing up in the church every Sunday, sitting in 1,000 pews, listening to the fire and brimstone fall, promising I would never call myself by the names they vilified. Gay was a title not just for stupid, but for sinner and unsanctified. So I wove my face into a mask that smiled while they lied and taught myself to laugh and sing while inside I died. And I remember the day I was finally overwhelmed by the pain and grief and hate and loneliness and chose to leave that culture of false righteousness to search for heaven in some bluer skies. The day I chose happiness instead of lies. The day I chose to love myself and realize God's love was not predicated on whether or not I liked other boys. And I can find happiness. He sneaks into my heart. On days when peace pervades the recess of my mind, and heaven's gift of forgetfulness casts a shadow behind my eyes, and the cries of my childhood fade into a blessed silence spoken by the beauty of creation on my sight. But that blissful peace is ever marred by a sudden jarring barb of memory where the 1,000 voices of my past start shouting in a violent storm and joy's insubstantial form vanishes from my sight. So forever wars the past within, and I can never be free of that childhood whim that calls my very essence sin. The pain is fresh, the shame inside. And I remember. So this piece explores, quite obviously, of course, specifically my experience with abuse in the church and abuse growing up in a conservative context of traditional gender roles of masculinity and femininity that I've spoken before about how I just did not fall into. I guess the realization that came recently that being gay is not often in our North American or Western context a sexual identity, but it's a gender identity in many ways as well, because so many of us grew up, knowing we weren't boys or we weren't a part of that community or that gender identity, but knowing we weren't girls either. We were this kind of third gender. And if you think about the way that pop culture or TV or television even treats gay men in particular, gay women as well too, they're even presented in that way, this kind of third separate gender. It's the punchline often too. It's the problem with representation for us in film sometimes, is that, the stories aren't ever about us, or we're not normal, quote unquote, people in the story, or the protagonist. You're either a punchline character, a comic relief, or a sidekick character that supports the, heterosexual main character. But the punchline or the joke of that comic relief character that's gay or queer or different in some way is, for gay men and gay women, is the punchline was often about how they were gendered differently, how they were breaking gender roles. So for gay women, this might be jokes about the fact that how masculine they were, that they like woodworking, things like that. Or for gay men, the punchline will be about how feminine they are, how they love shopping or gossip, or whatever it is that the joke is about them being feminine. So I try to point that out in this when I talk about, I remember what it was like growing up in a life where I was the butt of every other boy's jibe. In my side, knives driven deep by insecurities they hide. So trying to express that experience where growing up in a community of toxic masculinity, where there are young boys who are also developing their gender identity of what it means to be a man or gendered as a man. And in this culture of toxic masculinity, that often becomes a dangerous thing where one cannot express any feminine traits. I often tell people that may not understand, but that straight men experience homophobia too, through the lens of they are shamed and called gay anytime they do anything feminine or that breaks traditional masculine gender roles. And that must be very burdensome for them too. Often instructs why they then are cruel to others, which is not acceptable. We are always responsible for our actions and the way we treat others. But it's good to remember that they as well experience gendered abuse in this way, gendered pain, that it must be a very difficult and hard thing to have to suppress your emotions and kill anything that is perceived as feminine within yourself. So then I even explore that idea too, that then the abuse that's given to those who are gender traitors or gender nonconforming, or in this case, gay, male-bodied or female-bodied people who are ostensibly male or female, but then express gender traits that are opposite to what their sex is or what others perceive they should have as that gendered or sexed person. That we then often become the focus of that animosity, that self-hatred of boys or girls who feel that they are trying very hard to live within a very strict understanding of gender roles. They feel they need to then attack those who say that that's not true, or that's not the reality, or it's okay to be, a little bit more fluid in your gender identity, because it threatens that lie, that self-deceit they're trying to hold on to in their own mind. In fact, there's even a couple psychological hallmarks of that in the way that we try to self-deceive. And one of them is idealization, and that's the overemphasis of the positive traits of a person, place, or thing. In this case, masculinity, for example, or like the traditional trappings of masculinity are overemphasized and idealized as perfect. And the point being that the person is trying to place all their needs and desires and fulfillment upon that thing. And in this case, masculinity can provide all those things for them. It is all encompassing. It will give them everything they need, and they don't need femininity then, because masculinity is so amazing and great. And that's a way that we try to deceive ourselves and convince ourselves, especially when you're trapped in a culture that doesn't allow you to have any other option. And so that self-deceit becomes abuse, and you then have to attack the thing or the person in this case that is directly contradicting that self-deceit that you are creating for your own protection. Which is why then I say, they compromised by shouting their fists into my eyes, beat unto death their reflection in the iris of my cries, destroy the image that revealed their lies. These eyes that proved kindness and creativity were more manly than beating up a faggot until the spark of hope for happiness in his smile has died. And I guess highlighting the point that those of us who are gender non-conforming in whatever way, why we become the focus of abuse for people caught in toxic masculinity or toxic femininity, which is absolutely a thing as well too, which I'm sure my lesbian sisters or those who are female-bodied and do not express or experience femininity will have experienced as well. In particular, what comes to mind immediately is people who are what some may refer to as trans exclusionary feminists or TERFs. This kind of toxic subculture within feminism that tries to exclude particularly trans women based upon a variety of things. But I know I've gotten into a couple arguments on Twitter with people who try to use biology as the excuse to be discriminatory against trans women and like to paint them in the light as if they're all men who are trying to get into restrooms so that they can abuse women, when that is obviously not the case. They're probably experience way more abuse than pretty much any other person on the planet. But it's unfortunately a thing. The second part of this, I go from purely the burden of being a gender nonconformist as a child in a world that has very strict gender roles and expectations, to the next kind of trauma of my life, which I've mentioned before, but haven't gotten into too much detail, and that was when I was abused by a church leader when I was in junior high. And without getting into specifics of the action or that, because I don't think that's necessary, also I feel like often it's really bad that we try to expect victims to tell us exactly what the abuse was. Like, well, what kind of abuse was it? You know, because people also want to grade abuse severities. People just assume, first of all, you know, that things are sexual abuse, and if they're not that, then sometimes if it's emotional or verbal abuse, people start to caveat, like, well, is that really that bad? Or maybe you just perceive things different, and they immediately start to victim shame and try to start to assume that, you know, you didn't really experience anything. So that's why I feel like it's just not important to talk about it specifically or get into everything that happened, because really it's none of people's business. All that people really need to know is that abuse happened, and that should be enough for anyone, especially as a child. Who are we to judge other people's trauma on worse than better? That someone who just experienced emotional manipulation abuse, that I should judge them as less because that was just emotional abuse as opposed to physical abuse? Like, that's ridiculous and so unhelpful. So that aside, I kind of get into some specifics of what it was like to experience that as a child, and why this is, again, that kind of response is so damaging to people who have experienced abuse as a child, is that it was already so confusing in the moment. And I expressed that, I remember what it was like to lose my trust of men. So first of all, how difficult this was, because it was an abuse from a male figure, and already a difficult time of abuse from men in general. Well, at least other peers who were trying to learn what masculinity was and shame those who don't express it properly. But now here's abuse from a trusted male mentor figure, and one who was a friend and whom I loved. He was the coolest of the youth leaders in our group. Everybody wished they were in his group. So when you're abused by someone like that, you can even lie to yourself that the things you experience aren't real, because it's often subtle at first, or it seems like it's normal, or maybe it's just me who's having a problem with something that should be, you know, not a big deal, because that's what they say too, like, this isn't a big deal. And, you know, there's a lot of gaslighting that goes into it, especially when the relationship is so close and they have so much power in telling you what is moral and what is right and what is normal. And then when it's around topics that are taboo amongst a culture like conservative Christianity, where you're not supposed to talk about anything that's bad like this, and victim shaming is completely normal and in fact the go-to. How do you even tell anyone or talk about it? And so there's a long period of time where often these subtle and small abuses begin to build as an abuser is grooming a young child to be a victim in many ways, whether it be sexual, physical, or emotional, because these things are often about power and exerting power over another over a child specifically, but over another in general, because the same thing happens in adult abuse. And it's not even about the action as much as control sometimes with people who are a little bit of a sociopath in that way. It's really not about the action. And people often, that's the other reason I don't like to talk about the specifics, because it's often not even about that. It's not even about the specific action of abuse. It's about the control or the manipulation for a lot of people. And that's why I try to express it in this way too, where I say it's like words and hands twisting reality to a dark and blurred projection of his sin, like a demon in my mind worming its way in, like a cancer spreading fast within the perceptions of who I am. You know, it's the specifics don't matter, but that's what it feels like, you know, that this person is messing with your very perception of self. The other thing that's new here that I haven't talked about before is a specific moment where I finally, I guess, realized and moved on from it, because I had talked with some things with my parents after one specific event happened in January at winter camp, where all of us were in the mountains with this religious leader for a weekend retreat at the Christian camp we all grew up going to for summer, but then we also got to go in winter camp in January. Something very specific happened then that then I talked to my parents about, and it was because, this is actually the really messed up part of it, is because part of that was him telling me, because he was upset with me because he also worked for my mother for the theater company she ran, and I had casually mentioned something that, I don't know, he was like backstage chatting with students when he was supposed to be doing something else, but I didn't know that, and I just like mentioned it in like an offhand way, and he got in trouble because he wasn't doing something he was supposed to be doing. But I think it was apparent that I had been the source of that information, and so he was very angry with me about that. And then this weekend at winter camp, that anger turned into some very specific actions of abuse. And that's why I think the first time I kind of realized that something was wrong, because when I came home, well, at the winter camp, one of the ways that this worked out is not only was there abusive actions, but there was also a convincing of me that I was the evil one, I was the bad one, where he actually forced me to apologize to my core group members, my other peers, because he told me that I was a gossiper and a liar, and I was spreading all these awful things about other people, and I did this all the time, and everybody knew it. And I had to apologize to all my peers. And I was, of course, being quite sensitive, believing young person. I was so torn up about that. I apologized to them. I felt so horrible. And I came home and I actually even apologized to my mother and said, like, I do all these things and I'm so sorry. Like, I'm such an awful person that I lie and gossip about people all the time. And my mother was so confused because she was like, no, that's absolutely not the case. And when she said that, I think that was the first time I'd realized it just brought into focus all the ways that he was twisting my perceptions. And that was the moment I first, I think, started to realize that what I was experiencing was wrong and bad. Even some of the more darker things were wrong and bad, because you can even lie to yourself that it's not. Especially as a child, you just don't have perception or understanding about what's happening to you. It's crazy. Even nowadays, as an adult, 20 years later, or 30 years later, excuse me. Oh no, 20 years later, yeah. No, 20. I won't make myself older than I am. Even 20 years later, I still have very blurred memories of those times, because I was 12. I mean, your cognitive functions are still developing, and your memory is a temporal thing. It's very easy for adults who have very complex and well-formed cognition to twist your reality. In any case, when I told my mom that and apologized to her, and her saying, no, that is not the case, you're a very sweet and, sensitive young person who does not do this. In fact, you're the kind of the opposite of that. That made me realize that, holy crap, that was a lie. And that was the first time that also I told my parents some aspect of it. And we started talking about leaving the core group. And we went to the church leadership to say, this is what's happening. And we didn't get into too many more of the specifics because I didn't tell them some of the I guess, worse things that had happened. But, we started that process, and it was a whole thing. And of course, he was very upset because, I was doing this, and he lied to my peers and their parents, who all loved him, that I was trying to get him fired for, lies, and I was being a horrible thing. And so that's why at the end of this also, I say it was me who was ostracized. But in the end, what finally ended it was one day we were all leaving church. I was still in the core group. We were talking about me leaving, and it was all starting to get dramatic. And the whole group was leaving, and everybody was talking about going to the Nickel Arcade to hang out, which I was, was one of the things we did for fun. And I was like, oh, are we going to the Nickel Arcade? I didn't, this person must not have told me, or our leader must not have told me. And they were like, yeah, didn't you know? And then I asked him, I was like, oh, are we going to the Nickel Arcade? And he was like, everybody can keep going. And then pulled me aside in the church parking lot, a huge mega church. So this very large parking lot that was, emptying of people as people left from Sunday service. And he told me basically, once again, shaming me and making this about me, and I was the evil one, that since I was thinking about leaving the core group and I had said all these lies about him, and I was such a bad person that he couldn't in good conscience allow me to participate in any events with the group because I was such a bad young person. And then left me alone in the parking lot sobbing, as then he went off with the rest of the group. And that was the moment that broke finally, that there was still some hesitation and poor understanding of what was actually happening to me, and I was still trying to make up excuses for him in my mind, because I loved him. He was a mentor figure, and even though he did these awful things, I still didn't have that perception properly that they were bad, really, or I was making excuses for him. Very Stockholm syndrome. Finally, that broke it. That was the end. And I then went to my parents and was like, I need to leave now. I have to change groups. I have to leave. And I lost all my friends because they were in that group, and I had to go to another group. And thank God that this new group, the leader of this other small group, was maybe the kindest man I have ever known in my life. Very introverted, slightly socially awkward, wonderful young man who was so kind and understanding and so patient, and exactly who I needed at that moment in my life, because he was very unassuming and forced himself not at all on my process and allowed me to be a part of the group in a lot of trauma and stress and confusion and be safe. So I'm very lucky and thankful for him, as well as my parents, who believed me when I told them, and the one church leader who believed us when we told him. He was the head of our year. So, I was in 8th grade at the time. So he was the lead of the 8th grade kids. He believed as well. However, unfortunately, the church leadership above him did not wish to take any more action, because this leader was so popular, especially among the parents, who then attacked me and blamed me for all these things because I was lying and trying to get him fired. And it's easier to not deal with that. So the church just decided that, me switching core groups, and then they made him apologize for hurting me. And he gave a very I'm sorry you felt like I did these things, which is of course not an apology, and wash their hands, and voila, everything's good. And still he led worship on Wednesday nights, and this is why I say I had to attend church every week and stare into my abuser's eyes. I had to continually see him, and when he led worship, I got so upset I would be physically nauseous and feel like I had to vomit and be curled up in a ball. And so their solution to that, instead of making him not do that anymore, was just to call us on our home phone and leave a message on the answering machine that he was leading worship that night, so I would know to not go. And that's how they dealt with it and moved on. And then the next part here, we're building upon trauma. But then I talk a little bit more specifically about the first time I went to therapy. Because I don't know, those of you who are gay as well, they experience, well, for my generation as a millennial, we had the internet of the period of dial-up where we had to wait. Also, there's only one shared computer, so we during sexual awakenings, when young boys or girls start looking at some racy images sometimes on the internet. We had to wait for JPEGs to load on our dial-up internet, but in the living room, which is an experience I think that young people now will never have to deal with, as they have access on their phones to all kinds of things. But it was definitely not a unique experience to me to be young and look at underwear models on the internet. But definitely did not know that the internet had a history and that you could look it up and see it after. And so parents, shock and surprise, saw searches and such for things like that, and had a very awkward conversation, which, as I think I mentioned before, was started with the question, "Are you confused?" And then ended up in therapy at the Christian university where my mother worked, and eventually I would attend as well. And this, therapist, quote unquote, who was a PhD student, I believe, that was finishing his practicum, tried to help me, deal with my confusion and why I was looking at men on the internet. I'm sure pornography was a huge issue as well for them in general, but the focus of it was definitely the fact that I was looking at men, not women. And I had just been abused, of course, by a leader, and I was in no place to trust or believe any person that was in power over me. And I acted and played along with this young gentleman and just helped him believe that I had come to a realization, and I just actively pretended to be reticent and then realized things and let him work with me until I was like, oh, now I understand. It's because I'm chubby and ugly, and I'm looking at these pictures because I hate myself and they're so attractive, and that's why I'm looking at photos of men and not women. And there you go, you cured me, I solved it. And he was all proud of himself, and that was it. He told my parents we're all good, and I don't know what they believed, but we washed our hands of it and then didn't speak of it again. But it definitely fomented in my mind the fact that this was wrong. And years later, I would continue to go through therapy of my own accord, because after that, I knew that it was so wrong. And of course, hearing in church as well, too, that I was actively trying to suppress that. And I went to reparative therapy later in life as well, too. Even went to the last conference of Exodus International, which was one of the more famous ex-gay ministries that then collapsed because its founder said, no, you can't not be gay. You can't, change. It's not a thing. But I went to their last conference even. I actually got to meet Lisa Ling when I was there. Lisa Ling was a reporter who used to work for the O Network, or Oprah, and she was actually doing an expose about ex-gay ministries at the time, and I was with some others who were kind of identified to be her guides or her interview with her about the process, and I got to meet her, which was very random and weird part of my life, but I digress. So in this spoken word piece, all of those things, so I'm building up to this point, and so we have the burden of toxic masculinity, we have the abuse I experienced from a church leader, and then we have the first time I started knowing that, being gay was absolutely wrong, and I had to go to therapy, and then that started a 10-year struggle of trying not to be gay. And so we have all this building upon, my developmental mind at the period, and all of that in the context of church, which is why in that kind of last main section, I talk about how I remember what it was like to live a self-embodied lie, I say, where, you're actually trying to change yourself to live this lie that you're trying to live up to a mountain of unattainable expectations, like Atlas holding up the world and bearing the images, I say, the weight of hate-filled images forced upon my infant eyes. And then I remember what it's like going to private Christian schools, both in junior high and college, where I say morality was the dress code, but hypocrisy was cool. How they weigh sins and how bad things are, that people are totally okay with gossip and lying and pride and just white privilege out their asses. But anybody who breaks cultural norms like gender norms or whatever it is. I went to a private Christian university. It was like even kids who were like from, say, like poor families, or and anybody who had like weird cultural quirks were so gossiped and lied about and abused in socially in so many ways. It's like that was what Christian society was to me, was a bunch of people who were just so abusive to anyone who did not fit their cultural norm. And for me, I say it was like ridicule piled upon the one who would not conform to a cultural preconception of a masculine norm. And that was the main way that they kind of saw me as an outsider. And on top of that, I also attended church every Sunday, twice a week often, for years and years and years, sitting in 1,000 pews, listening to the fire and brimstone fall, promising I would never call myself by the names they vilified. Gay was titled not just for stupid, but for sinner and unsanctified. I mean, I remember being in church when Proposition 8, marriage equality in California, was on the ballot, and having to sit in church as the pastor talked about how gay marriage was evil and how they shouldn't be allowed to have it. And so in the end, you have to like pretend. So I say I wove my face into a mask that smiled while they lied, and taught myself to laugh and sing while inside I died. That's what it felt like, that every day you had to wear a mask and you had to pretend and trying to force yourself to fit in, even though you knew you didn't belong, which is what I talked about in Blue Neighborhood, that poem, a couple episodes ago. And eventually I just came to a point where I knew that it was too much and I was going to be overwhelmed, and I finally left. But even that peace or that freedom that I finally found is still sometimes not enough, because there's still days where all that shame and guilt still sneak in, and I still doubt all of that, and I still think, well, maybe I was wrong, maybe they were right that being gay was wrong, and that I am evil, and I'll never find happiness, and all those all the trauma and all these things sneak back in. You can never be free of them. It's for those who have been abused, both by physically, socially, verbally, emotionally, whatever it is, especially systemically, like those of us raised in Christian circles, where it's not just a single trauma, it's a complex network of continual trauma. It really fucks with you. I may never be free of that net of evil that was done to me. It's pervasive and deep, and has required years of therapy to even be able to understand how deep and overarching it is. Which is why in the DSM, I think they're trying to include a new complex post-traumatic stress syndrome, which tries to take into account that kind of experience, where it's not just one trauma that causes PTSD, but it's continual, pervasive traumas that create a complex network of PTSD responses. Which is why I end at the very end, and I say, so forever wars the past within, and I can never be free of that childhood whim that calls my very essence sin. The pain is fresh, the shame inside, and I remember. It's why I called this poem I Remember, because it's not just a memory of I know, or I have a recollection of what happened, but I have physical memory, emotional memory, internal psychological memory of the things that have happened, and stress responses, PTSD responses to those things live inside my body, my emotions, my relationships, everything. And it's sometimes overwhelming and impossible to get beyond, it feels like, and it's terrifying at points. And I just don't think many people understand what that is like. So I think I'll perform this once again for you now, just that you've gotten the full picture. I remember. I remember the day I kissed loving goodbye as I stared into the pitfalls of my childhood's eye and willed every pubescent dream of happiness I had to fade like a flower that dies before it has a chance to smile at the bright blue sky. I remember. I remember what it was like growing up in a life where I was the butt of every other boy's jibe in my side, knives driven deep by insecurities they hide, internalized. They compromised by shouting their fists into my eyes, beat unto death their reflection in the iris of my cries, destroyed the image that revealed their lies. These eyes that proved kindness and creativity were more manly than beating up a faggot until the spark of hope for happiness in his smile has died. And I remember what it was like to lose my trust of men, to be abused by the hand of one called friend, to love someone so dearly I could not see him bend my will to his whim, words and hands twisting reality to a dark and blurred projection of his sin, like a demon in my mind worming its way in, like a cancer spreading fast within the perceptions of who I am. I remember getting left behind, sobbing in an empty parking lot, blind with tears my eyes, the deafening silence of my peers saying it was I who lied, bringing to light our religious leader's abusive side. And though he was asked to apologize that I felt like he had hurt me, it was me who was ostracized, forced to leave my friends behind, attend church every week, and stare into my abuser's eyes. And I remember what it was like to see my parents gaze in shock and worry when they found out a boy of 13 doesn't know the internet has a history, that it will not keep your secrets, that pornography loves pubescent lives. But what caused them to cringe in shock and alarm wasn't just the lurid caption of the human form, but that the subject of this little boy's gaze, a forlorn longing focused on the phallic horn that trumpeted his desire for an alternative kind of porn. Cut our somber film to cut away to years spent in reparative therapy. Play a heart-wrenching tune, plenty of slow-motion zooms, a sad vignette of shock and gloom as a boy of 13 watches the walls of his life close until he has no room to cry anymore. His existence already a sarcophagus of self-hatred, masquerading as righteousness. And when he has taken in the last fresh breath of happiness left to him, let the picture fade to black, and I remember what it was like to wish my death, to draw every last agonizing breath praying for the end. I remember what it was like to bear the pain, to wear the weight of 1,000 names for worthless the demons whispered in my brain. I remember how to live a self-embodied lie, to wake every day pretending to live by a mountain of unattainable expectations, piled upon the weakness of my shoulders like boulders on an ant, like the world held up by the trembling arms of Atlas. Every second his knees shiver and beg to break beneath the weight of hate-filled images forced upon his infant eyes. I remember what it was like to study in a private Christian school where morality was the dress code but hypocrisy was cool, where gossip and lying and pride were the rule, but a boy who liked theater deserved the cruelty of his peers. Ridicule piled upon the one who could not conform to a cultural preconception of a masculine norm that left no room for deviance. I remember growing up in church every Sunday, sitting in 1,000 pews, listening to the fire and brimstone fall, promising I would never call myself by the names they vilified. Gay was a title not just for stupid, but for sinner and unsanctified. So I wove my face into a mask that smiled while they lied, and taught myself to laugh and sing while inside I died. And I remember the day I was finally overwhelmed by the pain and grief and hate and loneliness and chose to leave that culture of false righteousness to search for heaven in some bluer skies. The day I chose happiness instead of lies. The day I chose to love myself and realize that God's love was not predicated on whether or not I like other boys. And I can find happiness. He sneaks into my heart on days when peace pervades the recess of my mind, and heaven's gift of forgetfulness casts a shadow behind my eyes, and the cries of my childhood fade into the blessed silence spoken by the beauty of creation on my sight. But that blissful peace is ever marred by the sudden jarring barb of memory, where the 1,000 voices of my past start shouting in a violent storm, and joy's insubstantial form vanishes from my sight. So forever wars the past within, and I can never be free of that childhood whim that calls my very essence sin. The pain is fresh, the shame inside, and I remember.